a very, very warm welcome, Catherine, to Rock Bank Fellowship online. And we're so thrilled, we're absolutely thrilled to have you here, and so much looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you very, very much, Caroline and Hazel and all of you, because this has been in the diary for quite a while.
Yeah,
In fact, I even we were going to do it last year, weren't we? And I
yeah,
cancelled, unfortunately. I was rather run down and not up to it at the time, I think. But this is really great because I've been looking forward to this for ages. Had a couple of meetings with Hazel already on Zoom because of another sort of fellowship, I suppose we're part of now. Because I expect Hazel's told you about all the ex-nuns,
yes,
the after the cloister group, who are other. Many of them are people I knew already. I mean, I have I have cultivated the friendship of other people who've been inside because we have so much in common. And I've got quite a few former Carmelite friends and the odd, person who's been in another order. But since the book came out, that's really burgeoned because I've had so many letters and emails from people like Hazel who got in touch having read the book and then introduced themselves. And now we're all communicating. Well, some of us, not everybody likes going on Zoom or wants to, but there's a group of us that have been meeting. So I've met Hazel, and it's just such a privilege, especially knowing in Hazel's case that her experience of monastic life goes right back to the 1960s. Is it, sort of what I think of as pre-Vatican II days. Um, and it's just so, from what Hazel's told me, I mean, it's such a completely life define, not defining in the sense that it closed off other things, but it was a massive thing.
yeah,
I understand, and it cannot but be. I mean, the same with this, the experience. You never leave it behind. You never
yeah,
ever. I don't want to say
yeah,
get over it, but it, everything else in your life after that is somehow in dialogue with that experience. It's
yeah, yeah,
yeah, it's a relationship with
yeah,
God, with yourself, with the monastic concept. There's all this stuff going on that does define you in a way.
yeah, yeah, yeah. How lovely. Well, when we spoke the other day, we decided, didn't we, Catherine, that we might start off with you reading a little bit from your prologue. Um, so are you still happy to do that?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, then, Catherine, over to you.
Okay. So yes, as some of you may know, the book, although the book's quite reflective, it does follow a narrative arc. And it starts with a dramatic prologue, which is really a flash forward to the last chapter. And it's in a much more dramatic mode than some of the chapters, which are a little bit more theological or contemplative, or sort of explanatory of what the life was about. This is the kind of dynamic bit at the beginning that's meant to sort of plunge you into what's at stake, etc. So, prologue. In my mind, I'm still running, running towards the road, running, running, running. The darkness is fresh around me, the air slicing across my face in wild, clean shafts. The rush of oxygen is fizzing, moonlit, completely unexpected. I'd forgotten what night tasted like, the great dome of it, just as I'd forgotten what it was, after 10 years cloistered, to run cold and wild and wet, beyond enclosure. I'd forgotten what it was to stand under the sky and feel the far stretching of infinity. I'd forgotten what it was to stand and look up and turn and twizzle my head this way and that, amazed, engulfed in stars. I'd forgotten what it was to move and breathe and spread wide my arms and feel no walls. Now I am running fast and newly free, my feet sunk in wet greenery on the grass verge. My socks are damp, my ankles brushed by foliage. The first shock after the careful terror of the locks and keys, the infinitesimal turning of the handle, had been the floodlighting that rose up before me, sweeping the gravel forecourt like a great white whale as I stepped out. For a moment I had thought that was it, the game was up. There would be an alarm. There would be footsteps rushing, voices, torches. My mind spooled. I just stood very still and looked, took in the frightening, glorious wide space in front of me, the beam of the lights over gravel, and decided there was nothing for it but to go on. Beyond the lights were dark trees. Beyond that, there were fields, black carpets of freedom only bumpily illuminated in places by the moon. Halfway down the long drive, I stop and look back for a moment, expecting to see lights popping on in the windows, faces looking out. But there is nothing. No change, no movement about the sleeping house. The monastery slumbers. The low moon hangs vigilant over the hushed, teeming landscape. Cells are shuttered, slices of corridor seen from a distance, static, deadly quiet. And then, only then, at 100 yards, do I begin to breathe, to stop and note the startling feelings that are welling up inside me. I'm astonished at the freshness of the night, amazed to find myself feeling safe, surprised at the sense of boundless space, surprised especially to hear my voice saying out loud, quite clearly and confidently, to God, or whatever guardian spirit may be listening, "Thank you, thank you, thank you." And then I am moving on again, breathless under the stars. I've taken virtually nothing with me, just my viola and a plastic bag containing a few necessities. When I next look back at the vast, towering house that rises like a fortress against the sky, I see it for what I now think it is, a place of danger and of dishonest murmurings. I look at it with relief and incredulity. Incredulity that this place held me for so long. Incredulity that I'm safe. Incredulity at the beauty of the surrounding natural world. It is so good. Safe, safe, safe. I'm safe, I keep repeating to myself, as though I cannot quite grasp or get used to the idea. My voice peters out. I halt again near the lodge, close to where the gravel drive meets the country road, and look back one last time at the now toy-sized Gothic spectacle. How small and powerless the house looks at 200 yards. How foolish and flimsy, like a cutout against the beauty of the infinite moonlit sky. Relief surges through me, and I breathe and turn finally towards the road.
Oh, thank you so much.
Ta-da,
Thank you
and
so much. What
read
a
on.
compelling, yeah, I mean, what a compelling opening, that had me hooked and everybody else, completely from the get-go. I mean, there was no way that I was going to put that book down after that. I
It's a bit,
started off just getting the sample, a Kindle sample. And then as soon as I'd read that, then I went for the full thing and I went for the audio, so yeah, that really did have a hook.
thank you.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you. Well, I'm glad it spoke to you. It's so difficult to sort of judge, to get it just right, knowing how people will interpret it. Because I nearly started with a cell, my first draft. Or did I? No, actually, no. I think I was always going to start with drama, and then yeah. But the next chapter was going to be the cell, and instead I have my first morning, and then.
Yes,
But
exactly. I mean, I love the way that you have this, the prologue and the epilogue. And everything then is between that, and you set the scene, and and at the end you reflect, and it's just a beautiful framing. It feels so symmetrical. It's a beautiful framing of the story, I feel,
yes,
and
well,
enables. Sorry.
well, yes. I mean, it's very important, I feel, to frame. In this case, I needed to frame it and put it in context, and I mean, the thing about this kind of particular prologue is, although after this we cut to my first day and my honeymoon period of loving the monastic life, you
Yeah,
know from the off that things are not going to work out to
yeah,
plan. um, yeah, it's a kind of mixture of sort of, the book is a mixture of my reflections, my odd, being as honest as I can in not just remembering, but sort of delving into what was really going on and sort of analyzing it to some extent,
yeah,
and trying to introduce the non-initiates to monastic life in all its beauty as well as its
yeah,
dangers.
yeah,
It's a mixture of that sort of deep reflective, that's the real work. But the other work is the craft of storytelling and
yes,
communication that sort of is a different thing, that's more to do with
yes,
how it lands on the ear and how, that takes more work, I suppose, a different kind of work that took more sort of, a few years of various drafts and writing various novellas and working on my writing as a technique, if you like.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but you hope that that serves the latter, you know.
Yes, oh, definitely, and it really does. I mean, I love the way, as part of the prologue, sorry, the prologue, you go back and you tell us that in so many ways you were the most unlikely candidate to end up as a Carmelite nun for 10 years at living a cloistered life, because you're a modern, well-educated girl from a liberal bohemian North London family.
Mhm.
So I wonder if you might refresh us on what were those steps that led from that description to your arrival at the monastery.
Yeah, just to put in, I think
Yeah,
everyone in Carmel thinks that they are the most unlikely candidate. I think
yeah,
most people feel like, why me? And you do
yeah,
get a lot of people actually who are unlikely. I
yeah,
was surprised at some of the other people, and they were probably surprised at me. They're not all goody goodies. They're not all naturally pious people, and it's because this strange mystery called grace, in the Catholic worldview, this grace is like something extraneous to oneself that comes in from outside, namely from God, but it invades you, and it compels you and it changes you. So yeah, that happened to me. And the stages would be, well, I was a relatively, I'd come from a relatively bohemian, very liberal indeed, um, North London family. My father was a painter. He was he was much older than my mother. In fact, he was already a grandfather when I was born. My sister and brother and I were all his late life second family. So he was in his mid 50s when I was born and nearly 60 when my brother was born. So by the time I was in my 20s, he was sort of in his 70s and he was like a granddad, And my mother was completely different, young, much younger than him, obviously, beautiful, volatile, wild, difficult. Whereas my father was not difficult. He was a very, very emotionally intelligent, kind, wise, wonderful man. Mum was great in her own way, but she was somebody who had a naturally theatrical sort of temperament. She was trained opera singer and actress, and she had some terrible experiences as a child that I don't think she'd ever even faced or talked about or thought about, and that meant she never really got over feelings of woundedness and rejection. So she was very emotionally sensitive and wounded. So we had a difficult family life. Mum and dad had separate bedrooms. They had separate lives. They didn't get on. There were loads of rows. And I was the eldest, so I grew up being the kind of trying to be the peacemaker and the spokesperson for my siblings and even for my dad, trying to placate my mother. And I seemed to have a bit of a avenue to my mother that the others didn't have. I was able to kind of talk to her a bit more than the others. So I always was set up in a way to be this kind of trying to balance everything and be a mediator, putting my own feelings, of course, very much to one side. Mum was the one who was allowed to be angry and or was 80% of the time. So we were never angry. Didn't know how to express anger because I was always trying to cheer her up and make everyone happy. So that's, probably fed just because I know that you're all deeply steeped in this wonderful transpersonal wisdom. So I'm just sort of this is just occurring to me, that for me, I had certain character traits that probably predisposed me to being sort of wanting to be submissive and obedient and good. Anyway, later on. But I did go through the teenage thing of sort of being a bit off the rails, but not in a really big way. I was always a bit of a, I was always into classical music, and I had a phase as an evangelical Christian when I was 15. So I was searching and very responsive to transcendence through music and poetry and religion to some extent. But a bad experience of evangelical church that I won't go into kind of put me off church completely when I was about 18. I experienced something which I interpreted as terrible hypocrisy, and I wasn't going to go, really, that's it. Christianity was just this sort of irrelevant thing. And I fell in love, and I had all sorts of experiences living in Paris and then in Germany, in Cologne, where I had relationships, and I had a quite exciting life doing experimental composition, mostly in the sort of world of music and avant-garde creativity. And really that all came to an abrupt end when my father died when I was 24. And I think for me, the experience of losing my father, who was my absolute bedrock in a family that was pretty rocky. Dad was the voice of sanity, and he was the source of love. He was in loco God. When my father died, it really was as though the universe had just stopped. The world has stopped going round. There was no foundation under my feet. It was extraordinary experience of dislocation and disorientation. And I remember getting the phone call. I was in Paris, where I was living an irresponsible life. And I got the phone call late at night. He died in February. It was snowing. And I looked out at the dark sky with the snowflakes drifting across. And it was a sort of moment of stasis and wonder and renewal, because I went through something like a conversion experience after that, which true to kind of the William James model of, varieties of religious experience, where he discusses conversion experiences. Mine was pretty classic. It started, I think, that moment when I got the phone call, but really reached its peak when I saw my father's body in London 2 days later in the hospital. Obviously, he had died, and it was that moment with his body that was really transformational. And I think it detached me. Whether this is just a grief reaction or whether it's a spiritual thing, I don't know, but I interpreted it as being an experience of God. It detached me from everything transient, and I had no interest in anything after that than knowing where my father was, what had happened to him. I couldn't believe that he didn't actually exist anymore. I didn't even try to believe that. It was as though I saw his body, I realized it was an empty shell, and he was still there with me. It was as though I could just talk to him, and he was in the room, and I started talking to him, and I was saying, Dad, where have you gone, bro? And it just I think that relationship with the invisible dad who'd gone, and the feeling that he was still there in spirit, and that he hadn't actually died, in essence, it morphed into the beginnings of a prayer life, because I was talking to Dad, and then after a while, it sort of was fairly natural to say the Our Father, and it was fairly natural to sort of lift up my eyes to a higher power. And I think the two there must have been some sort of convergence. Although I do believe also that grace is something like an extra ingredient probably that came into my life at that point to help me, because something I was really feeling helpless and lost, and I really needed some special help in my life, and I got it, and it led me into the church. I started by going into Anglican churches because I'd been brought up CV, and going back to the services. In fact, I already went to church as a choral singer, but I started going back with a new openness to what it was all about, and actually listening to the sermons, listening to the readings, asking questions. And I think that questioning and that searching and beginning to think that religion might have some answers that were connected with this whole thing of the eternal and the spirit and the soul. It's, if you take, well, you all know, if you take that searching seriously, it's an endless, golden thread. It just leads you inexorably and inevitably on a lifelong search. And I'm still, plumbing those depths and searching those heights, and And it took me really deep. And, people who go into closed orders are people who usually have had an experience that's totally overridden. It
Yes.
overrides common sense. It overrides your sense of self. It's as though something so much more important is there and is on offer that you just have to respond to it. And I haven't even told you about the material stages. Like, obviously, I had to become a Catholic. I wasn't a Catholic. And that wasn't a foregone conclusion. I looked at a couple of other denominations. And I was quite interested in the Greek and Russian Orthodox because I'd had a big Dostoevsky phase in my early 20s. And the brothers Karamazov definitely played into all this, and the sense of the novice monk, Aloysia, and the monk Zosima, and this whole sort of sense that there was this tradition. So I used to go and sit in I think it was a Greek Orthodox church in Kentish Town. And I liked just going when it was empty and just sort of sitting there and looking at the ceiling. It's beautiful. So I looked at a few denominations and I read very widely. There was a Christian bookshop really near where I was living in Kentish Town. It was called the Mustard Seed, and I used to go in, and there was an extraordinary couple. I would love to know what has happened to them. I was about 24, 25, and they were probably 45, and they were very experienced. They'd read everything, Kierkegaard, Dostoevsky, and they really I had long conversations with them, and they were actually Reformed, United Reformed, I think. But I started reading Kierkegaard and C.S. Lewis, and asking all the questions. And although I had a very positive phase as an Anglo-Catholic, because I loved the music and I sang in the choir, and I fell rather in love with the vicar, which was actually bad because in the end I couldn't bear to go to that church any longer, because of course he wasn't in love with me. That all fed in. And I think that was a very beautiful phase as an Anglo-Catholic, but I wanted something more. I felt that when I discovered Roman Catholicism, it had this 2,000-year tradition that was so comprehensive. The philosophy, the universality. I mean, there was so much about it that convinced me. I met some inspiring Catholics in London who worked in Mother Teresa's soup kitchen, the Missionaries of Charity. I was a co-worker with them, and that also added, a lot of conviction to the whole thing. So I decided to apply to become a Roman Catholic, and you have to go through a sort of course of instruction, which I did. For about a year, I went, for perhaps 9 months, I went to Westminster Cathedral every week for a sort of class of instruction. But my real education in Catholicism came more through my experience of it and through meeting amazing Catholics, which I did. And anyway, you probably want to move on to some other questions, but I did find myself hearing about the Carmelite community, and I went and I stayed, and I never wanted to leave. I fell completely in love with it. And I did a live-in, which you have to do for 2 weeks, and they vote, they accepted me, I went back. And then when you go in, there are lots of stages. From the first one is called postulancy, where you're there for 6 months in your own clothes. And then if you're voted for by the chapter, that's the kind of all the permanently the life vowed sisters are called the chapter. They're the body of fully professed nuns. If they vote for you, then you go through and you get clothed in the habit. You have a clothing ceremony, and then you sort of come out looking like a nun, looking like a medieval woman. And 2 years later, you take temporary vows, and another 3 or so years later, you take life vows. And you have rigorous formation, it's called, which I think is a rather frightening word because it really is a formation. They take you as though you're a sort of bit of loose jelly-like clay, and they form you into the Carmelite shape, and that actually never leaves you. But the ideology of the ideals, the beliefs of the Carmelite way of life are not casually transmitted by osmosis, although they are that, but there's a very rigorous and deliberate reinforcement and explicit transmission that happens all the time. Everything that is said or done reinforces it. So that after 5 or 6 years, you really have been shaped in a very specific way. And just to leap forward, leaving after many years means it's incredibly difficult to reconfigure your relationship with other people and with the world, because you continue to act the way you've been programmed to act, like a nun, in so many ways, and it's very difficult to. I don't think it ever leaves you.
Yeah.
But anyway, I've said so much already, so
Yeah, no, it's all marvelous. But can we go back to the beginning a little bit?
yeah.
I mean, one of the things that really struck me was you said, when I arrived at the monastery, I felt like I'd come home. You felt that really, really strongly, and you write so beautifully of those early times.
Mm.
Um, inviting you invite the reader very intimately into the world of the cloister, describing to us, its rich and hidden treasures. And there are two places at the beginning that I found really enchanting, where you describe your experiences of entering, if you like, into what might be called a divine presence, collectively through music, through the choir, and also personally and intimately in your cell. And I know you're going to read us some extracts from what you've written about the cell. But both you describe as being windows onto God, both of these dimensions of the experience. And you write at the beginning that the choir was a sanctuary of music and of soaring space. And
Mm.
on the very first morning, which was really beautiful, you sing out Deo Gratia, with all your full heart and full soul. Thanks be to God. And then you have this incredible um, string of sentences that begin each with "How glad I was." And then you tell us about this stream of things that you were so glad that you were behind those high enclosing wooden bars known as the grill. How glad I was to be seated in a stall that felt like, you say, the most secret and special place on earth. How glad I was to be claimed, to be repurposed and already hidden deep in Carmel's choir. And that's just so powerful. It's just a very powerful and beautifully um, composed expression of what you were feeling at that time, Catherine.
Thank you. Well, I suppose when I was writing it, I just had to go right back into it. I just had to go right back. Uh, I just was immersed in the writing. I mean, a lot of this was written during the pandemic when I had virtually no distractions, which was great. Um, the other thing is that I've never stopped thinking about it. So um, since the book's come out, actually, I probably think about it a lot less because I think I finally put together a sort of, I don't know whether it's that I've made sense of it, but I've somehow it's all my experience has been expressed and come together, and I've managed to communicate something. And so I think until then, yes, it was always very close to me, those experiences.
Yeah.
Um,
How
yeah,
how amazing that the book has served that almost healing function for you, the writing of it.
it has.
Yeah.
It's been very healing, actually. Um, I feel I've somehow done it justice, or at least I've dealt with it. Whereas, you know, if your whole way of dealing with it is just in conversations or even in therapy, I haven't had a rigorous experience of therapy, but I've had sort of phases of, bits of counseling, whatever. I always feel I'm just sort of wittering on. And I always feel vulnerable and sort of like I'm a victim of all this stuff. And then when you actually make something new out of it and put it
Yeah.
in writing, it
Yeah.
feels more like you're signing it off, and you're saying, well,
Yes.
okay, that's what it was like, and
Yeah.
it's done, and it's done, and I've grown through that.
Yeah. How marvelous! How marvelous that it's fulfilled that function for you. I mean, it's just it's wonderful, totally cathartic in that sense.
Yeah, I suppose so. I mean, I don't know whether I'm overstating it. Yeah, I mean, obviously I'm never going to stop feeling it close to the experience. um I think just since it came out, I've had some wonderful experiences of people within the church who've been in touch. And for example, about a year ago, I happened to meet a wonderful Dominican friar who perhaps 10 years earlier I might have shied away from. I might have not wanted to know, I might have needed that bit of space with especially, the Dominicans really represent the sort of doctrinal,
Yeah.
heavyweight purity of the church. Well, they used to anyway. And I met a really, really traditionalist one last year who's so wonderful and spiritual. And I went to see him, and we had a chat, and I was there for about 2 hours. And this has actually also meant I feel now I have far fewer negative issues with the Catholic Church. I feel now I'm a fully practicing Catholic again, because I think what I've realized now is that Catholicism, like all organizations, is not perfect. And if you can't wait for the perfect setup. I think one of the things that really helped me on my way also was I did an interview a few years ago with Sarah Maitland. I expect you know about Sarah Maitland. She's a writer who's written about silence, about fairy stories. She was married to an Anglican vicar. They got divorced. She became a Catholic, and she's a hermit until recently. Anyway, was a hermit in Scotland. Extraordinary woman. And I did an interview. I was interviewing her for a magazine called Monk magazine, and I asked her what she was famously very, very liberal when she was young in the 1970s. She was very, very liberal. She was at the forefront of women who were calling for reform and change of this, that, and the other. And she was a sort of activist, against the higher, feminist and all this. And I said, how can you, with your strong feminist and political, left-wing credentials, how do you feel about being part of the, visible, organized, hierarchical church? And she said the most wonderful thing to me, which was, she said, I think the church is like a very annoying grandmother. She might be maddening, but she's still your grandmother. And she said that to me. And it's funny how one thing somebody says can make a big difference. I've thought about that so many times.
Yeah.
And I think I can accept the church so much better now, because I realize that our family, of course, our relatives all annoy us. We are all interlinked, and we need them, and we're part of them, and we need to contribute to them. And it's sort of helped me reconcile myself a lot with the institution. Flawed though it is, it is also wonderful. I mean, especially now, the more exposed I am to the reality of secular life, the more I see how there are so many worse things. I mean, the secular situation as I see it, and I'm in danger of going on a rant here, so I won't. But there are so many things in the secular sphere that I find incredibly saddening. And I feel if only these people could just take a little bit of wisdom from the ancients and from Catholicism. I mean, there are so many things that I find incredibly sad in our world, and the world young people today are being shaped in. Catholicism really is not a bad option, and I'm pleased to see that more young people are now trying out the church anyway, and giving it a chance. Because I think that was one of my worries, that I would, of course, I critique things, and I show the dark side of the community, and I show flaws in the church, but I also hope I show that, for me, the church probably did save my life in many ways. Because when my father died, I didn't mention this, I'd reached a real rock bottom point in my life. My father had been ill and declining and depressed for 4 years, and it had affected me very deeply. So, the people aren't all good or all bad, and the church isn't all good or all bad.
Yeah. And you do show that, Catherine, so beautifully. I mean, you show the absolute sacred heart of the of spiritual experience, as well as the shadow, and you hold both. You hold both, and it's it's a wonderful story that you tell. Can we return to the cell, which is kind of like almost like the heart of the experience, isn't it? Would you mind reading us a little bit from the cell? I would love that. I'm sure everybody else would too.
That's fine. Yeah, the cell was very much the heart of. That's why I had this chapter quite early on to sort of try to take people into this space that will be very different from what most people will have experienced in the secular sphere. I usually start halfway down at the second paragraph, but I could go back to the top, depending how long we've got. And
Please, you
shall I go back
choose.
to the top? Okay. So the cell, chapter 4. At the heart of our lives was the seclusion of the cell. In the annals of our desert order, it held both a symbolic and a sacred force. It was an aid to purity of heart and a bastion against all forms of evil. The hermits on Mount Carmel had embraced the cell as a way of turning their backs on the world, the flesh, and the devil, that triumvirate of deceivers. God and a godly life were to be attained to the extent that one purged oneself of their power and of one's attachment to the satisfactions that they seemed to offer. In this, we were not only following the Carmelite way, but also those earlier ascetics of the Alexandrian desert, disciples of St. Anthony of Egypt, whose extreme frugality had given rise to the perennially instructive accounts known as the sayings of the Desert Fathers. Sit in your cell, and your cell will teach you everything, was one such instruction, attributed to a certain Abba Moses. We were called to be patient as well as pure. In spite of its rigours, the cell also offered a feeling of protection. It was a lonely place, yet it was full of presence. It was full of spirit, of watchful intelligence, perhaps full of ghosts. In Carmel, the unseen life was everywhere, and we acknowledged it as part of the everyday. It filled our corridors and it filled our minds. But the cell was particularly hospitable to it, this inhabiting, being the dedicated space apart where each nun lived alone with God. There we were hidden with our unseen spouse, and hidden from the world, which was our enemy, and hidden from each other. My cell was home to a pale, dusky luminescence. There was tremendous beauty in this shifting brightness. The other source, a single bulb that hung unshaded from a wire in the centre of the high ceiling, seemed half redundant. The low, orange-yellow pulse that it emitted seemed a wintry thing. Sad autumn afternoons and sorrowful evenings were when it came into its own, a proxy and a puppeteer, a contrivance, while the real light slept. Sometimes I did not bother with it. Even the moon gave enough glow to see the surface of the lake by. And prayer, our purpose, did not require many props, only our knees, which grew sore and calloused with the years, our dedicated minds and hearts, and our good will. The low wooden door, with its rope-lift handle and felt-lined latch, was a holy threshold. On entering the whitewashed space, the silence covered you like a cloak, and something in your heart sang into the stillness. Someone you knew was listening to you. Someone was there, waiting to give himself to the whole of you in return for your attention. Going the other way, my cell door gave onto a dim vestibule and then a landing, and from there onto a labyrinth of human complications, unspoken interactions that bred and shed and swarmed in the silence of the cold corridors. But the cell was safety. It was repose. Above all, it was ideal companionship. Yes, the cell was a lonely place, but also a lovely one, lovely in its strength and starkness. Even the loneliness was lovely. You might sometimes have felt shorn of comfort, bereft of human warmth and every shred of fellow feeling, denied the understanding that you craved, and yet you did not feel completely isolated. You felt cleansed. There was a palpable cushion of love around you, one that came from prayer, and even when your mind was circling and you felt trapped and tested, there was nowhere else in the world you'd rather be. the cell really was a kind of heaven. So that's first 3 pages of that chapter. Of course, I can't read it all, but it's I hope it gives you the sense that the cell really was central, and
Yeah.
it's it was where you were alone with God. Nobody was allowed in your cell. Nobody ever would go. You would never go into another sister's cell. The only person who was allowed, and our life was ruled by permissions of what you could and couldn't. So the only person who had permission to go in was the prioress, and she would only go in emergency, or she only, in my case, my prioress came in the day I left the Carmel, and that's the only time. So you had absolute solitude, which was great.
Yeah.
If you like
Yeah.
that sort of thing. I mean, I loved being able to close the door, know nobody was going to come in, and you had 2 whole hours a day of silent prayer, which you could take in your cell or in the choir, which was our chapel, or in the garden in summer. But the cell was really a kind of crucible and a
Yeah.
kind of protection. It was all sorts of things.
Yeah, and do you know, when I was reading those passages, I couldn't help thinking how similar it was to Teresa of Avila's descriptions of meeting the beloved in the garden and in the interior castle, and really they really were it's the same to me, the descriptions, because you write so beautifully as well. And,
Yeah.
it was
Well,
just, it really reminded me of that. And I thought, this is the heart of the cloistered experience, and what Catherine's experiencing really is cloistered life at this very highest octave at this at
mm,
this time. It really did seem
mm.
that was the center, the root and soul of it all.
Yes, I mean, the Carmel hasn't really changed that much since the days of Teresa of Avila. I mean, if her descriptions of meeting her divine spouse, or His Majesty, as she calls him sometimes, in the cell, it's all totally valid now. Um, I think if the only orders that take it to a greater extreme are the Carthusians, and yeah, the Carthusians certainly, and possibly the Cistercians, I'm not sure, but the Carthusians would have drawn me, but they didn't have an English branch. Um, I would have had to go join the Carthusians abroad, or the Carthusians had each person's cell in Carthusian life is like a little cottage where they do everything. They cook for themselves. So in Carmel you have what's called the common table. So you have all your meals together, albeit in silence, and you have recreation every evening for half an hour, which is called recreation. It doesn't feel like it's a sort of time where you all sit round in a circle and talk, supervised by mother. So for 23 and a half hours a day, you had to keep silence. For half an hour a day, you had to talk. If you were a kind of introverted, oversensitive novice who didn't say much at recreation, you were a cause for concern. At recreation, you were meant to be kind of jolly and chatty, but you were only allowed to talk about certain things. There were so many taboos. It was a very contrived form of recreation. It was really, I think, intended that we wouldn't go completely mad by, never having any outlet, verbally. And for things
Yeah.
like laughter, we did laugh a lot at recreation, which was great. Sometimes you felt like crying, but it was also a real training ground in this thing that was very big in Carmel, certainly with Mother Elizabeth. Overcoming of self. I remember the first couple of years I found recreation very difficult because I was very involved in my own emotions, and I'd sit there and I'd be thinking, why is she saying that? Or I'd feel, I was young and emotional and, hormonal or whatever, in my 20s. And I sometimes, I remember I found it very difficult to shed my own involvement in my emotions and enter into a kind of, you know, um, the it's now completely second nature to me. I think I do it all the time, apparently, but it's this kind of thing of being present to others and listening to them. And in a sense, you have to sort of take a leap out of yourself, out of your own ego and emotions. And that doesn't come naturally. After a few years, everyone's doing it. And, you're all it's sort of artificial because everybody's being incredibly positive all the time. It's like, oh, isn't it marvelous? Oh, wasn't wonderful? Have you seen the crocuses? But you'd never actually sort of say, God, I feel awful. You just never say that. You couldn't say that. So it was a sort of exercise in pretense, but also in the virtue of sort of, all sorts of virtues, basically to do with overcoming yourself, which was what was
Yeah.
the big thing.
Yeah.
Because the self was seen as an obstacle to God. And you had to kind of leave aside the well, in Catholic thinking, there are all these categories like the passions, the emotions, the appetites, these are all bad things. And so, the whole monastic life, you're very aware of all this and of the traditional teachings of the church on all these things. And you were very aware of what the virtues were, and you're striving at least to copy them, if not actually, you're striving to acquire them.
Yeah.
But anyway, recreation. But the Carthusians only had recreation once a week, and I thought, oh God, that would be great. But the only Carthusian place in this country was, and probably still is, Parkminster, which is for men. So I couldn't have gone.
that that wasn't possible. But
No.
you were still loving it, weren't you,
Oh
despite
yeah.
the
Oh yeah.
issues with the
I
recreation?
I loved it. I loved it. I
Yes.
think the thing is, well, it's easy. I said to you the other day, Carol, it's very easy to look back with nostalgia, isn't it? And I mean, I say I loved it, but I know that I cried every now and then. And I know there were phases probably when I cried more, when it got a bit more difficult after 2, 3, 4 years. It's much harder because by then the honeymoon euphoria has worn off and you've just got the daily grind and you've got the sort of
Yeah.
perseverance with gritted teeth, more or less.
Yeah.
Everyone says, oh, it's not meant to be through gritted teeth, but obviously there are times when it is. It's just sort of endurance. But
Yeah.
in the early years, I loved it because although I did cry and was very oversensitive and I'd feel very sort of keenly sort of things like things that felt like rejection, or there were these deliberate humiliations, which were
Mm.
part of the old way of thinking, which were
Mm.
terribly cruel, terribly, terribly cruel, that were all meant to sort of sever yourself, yourself from your self-love and all that. But I did love, and I think, however hard something is, if the overriding thing is a sense of purpose, there's so
Yeah.
much humans can put up with. And you read
Yeah.
stories of people putting up with much worse things and coming out, you know, just well, I'm flabbergasted by the extent to which humans can suffer and struggle and put up with things if they have
Yeah.
a reason for it and a purpose.
Yes.
You know what I'm
Yes.
talking about. These stories of heroism. Carmel tries to recreate those sort of that sort of atmosphere of sort of hardship.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the people who've really been through these things have been through wars and
Yeah.
concentration camps and humans can adapt.
Yeah.
And I think it's the sense of purpose, the sense also of specialness. Being a
Yeah.
nun, you're a young
Yeah.
woman,
Yeah.
and you've decided men are no good, or you've decided only daddy is good enough for me. It has
Yeah.
to be God,
Yeah.
When my father died, it's like I would never want to have another relationship with a man because it would feel like an insult to my father. That's how it seemed to me at the time.
Yeah.
Um, Nobody could take his place. So obviously you choose God, but what was I just saying about yeah, the sense of purpose, the sense of specialness,
Yeah.
being
Yeah. Because
some people love this idea of being a bride of Christ and wearing special clothes.
yeah.
I mean, I didn't sort of fetishize it. I wasn't sort of like, oh, I
No.
want a veil. I wasn't like that. But I did
No.
feel loved by God. Once
Yeah.
I got into the prayer thing before I went to
Yeah.
Carmel, I started
Yeah.
experiencing this, this great love of God that can happen to you if you go
Yeah.
deeply into the prayer
Yeah.
life. And
Yeah.
it for me also, I think it was part of God rescuing me from the grief and
Yeah.
bereavement and
Yeah.
everything. But you feel special when you feel loved, and you can do
Yeah.
anything if you
Yeah.
feel.
I mean, and you say, don't you, Catherine, that deep down I knew that this was what I wanted, and I
Yeah,
wasn't going to let anything, no minor irritation, stand in my way because I'd found what I wanted, and you really felt that really
I
strongly.
did. I felt it
Mm.
very strongly, and I think it was more like I sensed that everyone else had a similar thing of kind of really valuing their, what was called your vocation. Whether, it's very difficult to define, and if you've been in and then left, have you still got a vocation? I think a vocation is a lifelong thing. It's being called to be fully who one is meant to be, etc., in a spiritual way. But I think people felt it was a real privilege to have a vocation, and people almost, when the younger ones also wanted to like prove you had a proper vocation by being really good at being being a novice. But we all interpreted it in very different ways, and the difficult thing was we all saw it slightly differently. And gradually, what they do is they impose the kind of community view on you. And over the years, as a novice, you begin to sort of take on, this is how we've always done it at Akenside. This is how we interpret it. But for years, I really felt it was very difficult for me to move beyond, for example, some spiritual experiences that had been formative for me before I went in were things that weren't particularly welcome in the cloister. And I had to let go of even those things that I thought were spiritually good, because we don't do it that way in Carmel.
Yeah.
So I used to pray the rosary a lot when I was in my 20s before I became a Carmelite, because I'd met these marvelous co-workers of Mother Teresa in Kilburn, and they introduced me to the rosary, which at first sight I found a really off-putting, mechanical sort of form of prayer. But I found myself entering into it in a very slow, meditative way on my own, going at the pace that the spirit seemed to be, you know, setting up. I mean, I wasn't going to rattle through it, so I spent ages thinking about each word, and it became very important to me. And I think I was very bound to this idea of I have to say my rosary every day. And in Carmel, it's like, no, well, we don't do that here. We have the Divine Office, and we have this and that. Also, fasting. I thought it was very important to fast on bread and water. I was terribly hard on myself in those days before I went in, because I was an enthusiast and I was a convert, and I was really going to do this properly. You know, I was going to be radical. And the fasting in Carmel didn't seem nearly tough enough to me. Looking back, of course, I realized all the other things that were tough more than made up for that.
Um, but there did come a time, didn't there? I mean, I'm just kind of moving on a little
Yeah,
bit
yeah.
now. There did come a time, sooner or later, as you say, as you tell us also in the prologue, when you did really have to face the shadow, and you call it, you describe it as which I thought was wonderful, as an ill wind from the underworld, you know, that kind of swept in, and I thought that was a brilliant
I've forgotten that. Ill
description.
wind.
Yeah, I think you do. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, maybe I've made that up. I
No,
don't
no,
think
no.
I.
So I mean, I hadn't read it all through, you know. It's like I've done that now.
Yeah.
But yeah, that is true. Definitely something from the underworld. Definitely, the shadow side was the real challenge of the life. It was the big challenge, because it's easy, you know, to fall in love with a community and a way of life, especially if it gives you this sense of specialness, you know. And it's like, also, I'm one of the chosen with a vocation. I'm doing this extraordinary thing that is so obviously special. It's, you know, it's so obviously not mundane, because you go in and, you know, there's the silence, there's the sandals, the veil, the singing, but actually there's a mundane side to the life. As every nun knows. There's a lot of sweeping and cleaning, and hard work, and weeding the garden, and also just this sort of obedience and the sticking to like the timetable. There wasn't a lot of room for individuality, and you know, none. They would say there was. They would say, oh, what you're, you know, everyone's meant to be herself, but there's a grain of truth in that, but there's more truth in the fact that you do surrender. You do surrender huge
Yeah,
amount. You surrender your autonomy,
yeah,
and you do things as a group. And the Carmelite charism is very much based on the idea of the eremitical, the hermit life, because the model for Carmel was Elijah alone on Mount Horeb when he hears the still small voice. So that is the model for Carmelite prayer. You're on your own on the mountain, open to God. You're not sort of rushing around doing useful works with other people. But all the same, there was a sort of group think, which was completely, that was one of the things that was difficult. I could feel it seeping into me in my early months, you know. You could just feel your mind being, it was like, you know, it was being refilled with all these new ideas. And you really had to, you know, you were changed. It was quite, that was the difficult thing, really, kind of not just the externals of the life, but the extent to which your natural way of thinking about things and doing things and feeling about things was not approved of and had to be surrendered. And then the real difficulty was when the dark night of the soul kicks in, which
Yeah.
is a couple of years in, the chances
Yeah.
are you're going to hit the dark, what they call the dark night. I mean,
Yeah.
I still wonder quite what that is, but it's a word that we know what it means, but I think I did find it troubling that, in a sense, that it was a sort of handy explanation for anything. Like if anyone felt like maybe they weren't meant to be there, or
Mm.
maybe actually they weren't meant to be a Carmelite, or maybe they should leave.
Yeah.
It was always like, no, this is the dark night. You're going to feel like that.
Yes.
So you're
Yeah.
meant to feel like that. So if you're meant
Yeah.
to feel lost and disorientated and
Mm.
unhappy, and then there's no basis for your saying, um, I'm not happy, because you're sort of,
Yeah.
it's like you're not
Exactly.
that's so that I found a bit worrying.
Yeah.
There were sort of ways of dealing with all the potential problems people might come up with that tended to boil down to, um, even thinking about leaving would be giving into temptation, and you must stay and you must persevere, and the virtue of this life lies largely in perseverance. And that really is hard,
Yeah.
especially when lots of other things are feeling very, very counter, um, when there's a lot of discord externally or internally or whatever. It's very
Yeah.
difficult, that feeling that you can't talk about it, you can't criticize anything, you can't question anything, you can't say, I'm not sure about this, or because it's just like, no, you just got to carry on, shut up. I think there are monasteries where there's a lot more of a sort of humane anthropology, is that the
Yes.
right word? A
Yeah.
sort of an understanding of the human person that
Yeah.
embraces stuff like the
Yeah.
need for people to question
Yeah.
and to have somebody to turn to. The eremitical ideal was that you were alone with God, so you turned to God, and looking for support in anyone else in the community was seen as a fault.
Yeah.
You weren't supposed to cry, you didn't cry on shoulders, you had nobody to cry on, the shoulder of. That's when it gets tricky. And then lots of people, when they're going through these stages, so it's typical that when people have been there about 3 years, they will be going through a very difficult time and
Yeah.
seriously questioning whether they're meant to be there. And then when you fast forward and look at the people who've been there 20 years, you can see they've been through, and they've
Yeah.
resigned themselves, or they've
Yeah.
matured into people who can cope with it all,
Yeah.
and they have a sort of greater degree of serenity. But
Yeah.
typically, somebody who's been there 3 or 4 years is probably going to be a bit turbulent, because
Yeah.
you're
Because
just, you have to sort of align yourself with this really tough um, sacrifice, and
yeah.
you have to keep on making that alignment, and it's not natural.
No. And several of the sisters um mysteriously fell by the wayside, didn't they? In your age group, you say,
Yeah.
and either left or were actually dismissed. Um,
Yes. People do quite often leave, really. People say that it doesn't happen very often, but when people are novices, they're in a training period, and as I describe in the book, I think three other novices left while I was a novice, and later on, some fully professed sisters left, as did I. And there were also things I haven't mentioned in the book, like people. Occasionally, somebody would come and live in, and might come for 2 weeks and then come back for 6 months and might leave. But you didn't talk about why they'd left. You weren't told why they'd left. They just left, and you were only told on the day that they were going. There was no real opportunity to say a proper goodbye. I think Hazel mentioned in the olden days there was no goodbye at all. In my day, that people only were told you were going like a couple of hours before you went, and then we were told that a bell will be rung and you can come and say goodbye. But it was literally just a token bye.
yeah,
Um, and then people weren't allowed to write to you for a year, and you weren't allowed to write to them, I think, or at least they wouldn't have seen your letters, because all
yeah.
the letters were filtered through the mother prioress.
So pretty
That yeah,
harsh
that was yeah. People
for
came.
some.
Oh yeah, very much. And there were
Yeah,
all the breakdowns as well, which
yeah,
was one of the big things that led me to think in the end, perhaps it would be really dangerous to stay beyond, a certain point, because so many people, they were the people in my age group. So I was born in the 1960s, and there were quite a lot of us in the novitiate for Carmel. In those days, Mother Elizabeth thought we were really flourishing because we had lots of young people, but they all cracked up. I mean, well, did they all crack up? A lot of them have, officially had breakdowns. I mean, hospitalizable, sort of breakdowns, and
Yeah.
a serious mental illness. And this began to worry me because I was thinking, well, I was the one who was sort of labeled the crybaby and the oversensitive one who, I'd easily cry. And yet I was the one who was somehow, I think I had an independence of mind that meant I wasn't totally sucked into this kind of clique mentality,
Yeah. Yeah.
which was very destructive indeed. People being very, very emotionally dependent on Mother Elizabeth and forming a sort of clique that was, it ended up being opposed to the actual prioress.
Yeah.
When there was a new prioress. I stood aside from all that. I didn't want to be part of a clique. I didn't want to. No, I think probably my upbringing had given me an ability to think quite a lot for myself. And as a convert, of
Yeah.
course, I'd done a lot of thinking about
Yeah.
Catholicism before I even became a Catholic.
Mm.
And a lot of
Mm.
people in there had just been brought up with Catholicism. I don't mean just, I mean, they've been brought up with it, but they probably hadn't come from backgrounds where people did a lot. Well, as I said, I came from a liberal background where it was natural to question and think and discuss. Very
I mean, you
Protestant thing to
start
do, I
your
suppose.
part three, don't you, with that quotation from John of the Cross, um, and it somehow and you call part three the truth, and it's somehow that you are moving into a different phase of your journey there, and in a sense the concept of the dark night of the soul is appropriate at that time,
Mm.
because then you have uh, questions, and you face your ambivalence about going forward to your final vows.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. Well, yeah, I mean, that sort of phase around making your final vows, you'll have been there 5 or 6 years by then, and it can be a typical kind of time of struggle with the Dark Night. And well, I say, the quote from John is, "On a dark night, kindled in love with yearnings, oh happy chance, I went forth without being observed, my house being now at rest." And in John, of course, this is a metaphor for going out from oneself into the darkness of pure faith. But because it does sort of resonate also with my actual running away in the night, which was a sort of external, I don't know, obviously it's applied in a different way there, but
Yeah.
I think I use that for part three because there was that sense of darkness and of that sense of, a mixture of kind of the kindling of love and yearning, but also darkness, which is perplexing. Yeah,
Yeah.
it was, and I was saying I was born in the 60s, and those of us who entered in the 60s or the 70s, because we had a few younger ones come after I entered it, they've all left, of course, except one, I think. We were seen as kind of being a bit soft compared with, I mean, now it's it's different now, but I mean, we were often compared with the kind of the tough ones who had lived through the war or the 50s, and the mother and the other kind of people in charge of the older generation. They remembered, well, Hazel will know, the greater hardships of the early days, and they've been, many of them have been brought up during the war, so they saw us as a bit feeble, actually. But looking back, I don't think we were. I really don't think we were. I think there was a lack of support mentally and emotionally and spiritually. There was a complete lack of acknowledgement of individual needs, and except in certain cases, it was all very unevenly applied. There were some people who were given a lot more support than others. And I think if you came across as quite poised and quite able to look after yourself, they just sort of left you to it. And I realized you had to ask for help, and sort of, I probably didn't. I probably just wanted to be perfect. So I sort of battled on until it all became too much.
Yeah, I mean, in your chapter, resolution, there's a series of very arresting passages where you are where you're having this continued and exacerbated ambivalence about carrying on. And there's one impromptu encounter with Mother Elizabeth in one of the little alcoves, I believe, where she asks for your written application to proceed to your final vows. And I think she asks you, are you still sure you want to go on? And you find yourself wanting to scream out, no, 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 but instead you say yes. So you're obviously terribly conflicted in that moment.
Mm. That was
Yeah.
that was a terrible moment. I remember it. But what was so, you see, you're trained to go against yourself. And the idea of virtue often was, that your innate instinctive responses came from the self or the ego, whereas the spiritual response was the higher part of you, the volitional part of you. I mean, psychology, I'm sure gives, is it the id and the whatever, the superego and all this stuff. But I mean, you were not, it was considered giving into yourself to say what you really felt about things. Otherwise, people would be like they are out here, and everyone complaining about everything, attacking each other all the time. So we were all trying to be very, very overriding our natural selves. So you got
Yeah.
used to saying yes when you didn't necessarily
Yeah.
want to, but you
Yeah.
wanted to be that person who could say yes. You wanted to be that person who was pleasing to God.
Yeah.
And you didn't know, in the end, you didn't know where the line to draw the line between like forcing yourself and, because there's, on the one hand, you could say that saying yes when you feel like saying no is dishonest, but there's another way of looking at it, which is it's you're overriding yourself. I mean, getting up in the morning was like that. I didn't feel like getting up at 5:15, but you didn't just lie there. You forced yourself up. So when she said, "Are you sure you want to go ahead?" I said yes because it was the right thing to say and it was
Yeah.
duty.
Yeah.
But there was a panic going on inside me, and part of that
Yeah.
panic was because at that moment um, the normal sequence of events would be you would have put in when the right moment came, when you were eligible to be considered to take vows, you would write a written letter to dear mother and sisters, whatever. I can't remember the exact formula, but there would have been a formula, but you would it's something you would have written of your own accord in the quiet of your cell, saying, "I would like to apply to be considered to take vows." And then she takes that letter to the chapter and they say, Sister Catherine Mary has asked, and then they consider and they discuss and they vote. But actually they did the vote without my having written that. And I really felt, suddenly I realized I hadn't written it. And then she asked me to go and write it. Now that was the wrong way round. And I felt completely on the back foot, because if it had come from me, if I'd I was asking myself, why haven't I written that letter? The crazy thing was, I asked a year earlier. Well, I didn't really ask. I assumed that we were going to make our vows a year earlier, because in the olden days it was after a year. And then I was told that we were being kept back for another year, because somebody else in the novitiate didn't seem ready and they didn't want me to run ahead of her. Anyway, that's the whole story. But basically, I'd felt ready to go ahead with vows a year earlier, when I was feeling very pious and I was still on the crest of that honeymoon, that wave. But another year on, I had begun to experience the struggles and the questions were beginning to pop up.
Yeah.
And the so-called dark night was beginning to sort of, I suppose. I think the dark night really, it was like a sudden, when that moment when Mother Elizabeth said, "You've been accepted for vows, go and write me your request." That was when the dark night was like, it was just like suddenly a blind being drawn and I was plunged into darkness suddenly, because I thought, help. I felt like I was drowning. Like, help! Why are you asking me to write something that I meant to have written of my own volition, that's meant to be um, a prelude to your having voted? But I didn't say that because I'd said all along I wanted to take vows. So, but it did feel, I felt very much on the back foot, and I felt that the order was all wrong, and I felt suddenly I was being told to do something that I should have been asking to do. And I suddenly thought, gosh, what's going on? Do I really want to do this?
Yeah.
But I said yes because I'd spent 2.5 years there,
Yes.
saying yes every single day to doing things that, although I said I loved the life, I never loved things like washing in cold water. I never loved getting up in the morning really early. But I mean, I loved the
Yeah.
sense of purpose and the beauty of,
Yeah.
there was so much that was beautiful as well,
Yeah.
which is why I've really tried to make this book nuanced and not, you know,
Yes.
you know, sometimes people think books by ex-nuns, or there have been books by ex-nuns that have been very much damning,
Yeah.
and they've just shown the dark side of their experience. And I've wanted to show both.
And you definitely do that. Um, However, there is at the end of that particular day, you have the most awful experience. You say it's interesting that you say that's when your dark night began, because you later go on to describe that, which I actually found very hard to read, that Mother then organises an impromptu concert, and she requests that you play a solo on your viola. And you choose a beloved piece by Bach, and you go on to describe your absolute sheer joy at playing this piece, of performing it. And you write, you felt like a bird set free to soar, which is a beautiful description. When out of the blue, Mother suddenly claps her hands and says, enough, enough, and bring on the tambourines. And then the whole um, evening sort of morphs into this raucous renditions of Danny Boy and even the Hokey Cokey.
Mm.
And later on in your cell, you say you felt like that would, as you describe it, was an exercise in forced jollity. Then you say, if I had been honest with myself, I would have admitted that at that moment, the dream had turned into the beginnings of a nightmare. Clarity had moved into confusion, beauty into harshness, and music into noise. That does sound like the absolute pits of your
Oh gosh.
experience.
Yeah. Well, that description is actually very, very typical of you know, we had recreation, but occasionally we'd have a musical recreation or some sort of celebration, and we'd Mother would like to sort of encourage people to sort of do, you know, sing and stuff. And I suppose, you know, looking back, as my sensibilities have been formed by, I've been mad on classical music as a teenager. I'd had loads of opportunities to develop. I've been played in at least two youth orchestras, and so, you know, I suppose I had quite a sort of, you know, privileged access to classical music, and my sensibilities have been formed by that love. But it was a real love, and it was a real way of expressing myself, and it was one of the deepest ways of expressing myself I'd ever known. Probably still is, playing music. Because for me, music's something I've thought an awful lot about, and written about. I think there's, you know, I feel there's a real channel to the divine in music, and it's, you know, it's a counterpart to prayer. It's like the other, you know, prayer is one way, but music is incredibly important to me. And the way she cut me off was so unsympathetic. And I know what she was trying to do is didn't want the others to feel that they couldn't take part, and that, you know, it was over their heads or whatever. So she was trying, you know, she was trying to make it all inclusive, but it felt so brash and tasteless and sort of, and it was very typical, unfortunately, because there was an awful lot of this. We did have lovely music at Akenside, and there were quite a lot of sisters who, although they didn't have any musical training and couldn't read music, had lovely voices. So we did have lovely singing, and there was a lot of enthusiasm for music. That's one thing Mother Elizabeth was great on. I mean, she really loved. She did let us do music, and she liked it, but there was all these jealousies, you see. People didn't like, you know, the fact that I became the organist, and that I was, you know, in a closed world, you know, this sort of thing really is, it sounds so petty, but it really, really, it can really, really feel
Yeah,
crushingly painful. And I knew that there were people who felt like that about me, and, you know, I was this posh southerner, you know, with my Bach. And so, of course, I had to be sort of put down. And it was like, oh, we'll just sing Danny Boy instead. And, you know, obviously it made me feel incredibly lonely, you know, obviously.
yeah, yeah,
Um, but,
yeah.
you know, I suppose there's two sides, and you have to think how the others might have felt. And yeah.
Yeah, yeah, which obviously you do, Catherine.
But yeah, I think the other thing is I've since then become very friendly with another Carmelite community. And I've realized that not all the Carmels, they're all very different. It depends who, you know, each Carmelite community has this sort of, you know, you have the rule and the constitutions and this absolute framework. But then the individuals who make up that community will define how it's interpreted. And there's another Carmelite community I'm sort of much closer to now, where they have a different attitude to music, and they've got a couple of really highly skilled musicians in the community, and they're more open to kind of what we might call loosely, wider culture and things like that. And I think I would have probably fitted in better in that community, actually.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
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 anyway.
yeah. I mean, moving to conclusion now, so we can bring in people to ask you questions. From that point, things really did go from bad to worse, didn't they? With all sorts of troubles, and there was an uprising. But the uprising, if you like, was cruelly and severely put down by corrections, and you were forced to cross-state yourself and bang your chest and say mea culpa and all the rest. And it was all got
Yeah.
too much, to the point where you one day had a routine injection and you collapsed, and you ended up in the infirmary, where several days later you were dragged from your bed and brutally beaten up by um, who was it? Mother
Yeah, yeah.
Irene of all people.
Irene.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
and it was then
Yeah.
then
That's because the thing.
I was just going to say that's
Oh,
when you
sorry.
decided
Uh,
to leave.
oh, did I? I can't you know, actually, this is the side I don't think about so much now. I mean, I don't know if it was at that moment. I don't think I decided to leave at that moment.
Yeah,
I think the temptation to leave and the kind of toying with the decision to leave was something that sort of gnawed away for a couple of years.
yeah,
But a very important turning point in the book is when um, there's an election of a new prioress. So in the Carmelite world, every 3 years you have elections, and all the finally professed sisters, so they're not the novices, but those who've made their life vows, they vote for the new prioress. And we'd had a kind of stable sense of like the same person always being re-elected. And even when she wasn't prioress before that, she'd been as good as prioress because she'd been kind of the right hand woman for the previous prioress. She'd been novice mistress. She'd never not been highly influential in the community. And um, I won't go into all the complexities and the reasons why that is outlined in the book, but basically the church hierarchy has started to discourage people repeatedly voting in the same person. For the reason that you get a perennial prioress, you get somebody on a pedestal, somebody who's inviolable, and no other, you know what I'm saying. So
yeah, yeah,
we were encouraged to sort of think about, who else in the community might be suitable prioress. It's not necessarily a good thing always to have the same person. And there was this shock election result when Sister Irene became prioress. And that's when the fault lines in the community became visible. And that's when I thought, hang on, this is really not, this really is worrying. Because, up until then, if you'd had any private thoughts about whether you agreed with things or not, you kept them to yourself. It was seen as a lack of humility to criticize, and you would always try to squash down your criticisms or criticize yourself instead. And then I thought, but objectively, this is just not right. We've been taught all along that the result of the elections is the outcome of the elections to show who the new prioress is. She's been chosen not only by the voting sisters but by the Holy Spirit. She's God's chosen one, and therefore she's treated pretty much like she's in the place of God, and she was given a huge respect and unlimited power over everyone and over everything in the community. And this had been accorded to Mother Elizabeth. She'd never known it otherwise. And she herself had taught us this thing of you obey the prioress and you treat her, she's in the place of God, she's a reflection of God's will for you. So I expected that principle to apply to the new prioress who was voted in. And suddenly there was this mutiny with a group of sisters who decided that the new prioress wasn't fit to be prior. She wasn't suitable. She didn't understand the Akenside ways because she had come from another community. She'd been a Carmelite for 20 plus years, but she'd been in another community that had closed down. She'd come to Akenside and she'd only been there 5 or 6 years, as opposed to, but she'd been in Carmel for 20 years and she was completely legitimately our prioress. And I thought this was a completely uncomplicated situation. She's the new prioress, just get on with it. But there was this kind of split in the community, and people who, didn't want to let go of beloved Mother Elizabeth and let go of the specialness that she was accorded and her position in the community, which had been quite irregular, actually. I mean, a prioress is in loco Christi and all the rest of it, in loco God, but she's not meant to be worshipped and she's not meant to be on a pedestal, and it had got like that. It had got very unhealthy and cliquey anyway. So that's when I woke up to the fact that there might actually be some objective, really serious issues in the community,
Yeah.
and lo and behold, there really were, and they came to light over those next 2 years.
Yes. Yes.
But standing up to that and sort of speaking my mind and having my independent thoughts apart from Mother Elizabeth, well, it was easy actually, but what was not easy was the fact that was facing the backlash, which was if you dared say that there was some sort of problem that the community needed to discuss, let's talk about this, let's see, what's not working. You were told, oh, we have no problems. It's damaging even to suggest that the community might have a problem, because we are the one true Carmel and we are Akenside, and we're not like those other Carmels that, closed down. We are, there was this massive sense of the community being, this exemplary Carmelite community, which meant you can't ever grow. There's no room for progress. There's no room for discussion. There's no room for honesty about problems. And then I thought, well, if you can't even say there might be a problem or talk about it to try to improve it, not to drag it down, but constructively. If you can't do that, then you can't work with a group of people towards any sort of growth or progress, because people aren't listening and they aren't open and they are on the defensive. And it was like this. It was like dealing with people who just brought shutters down and said, how dare you? So that was really difficult. The last few years were really difficult.
You were so bold, you were so bold, as
Oh,
you
yeah.
write. You were really bold, and in being so bold, you hung on to yourself, didn't you? Yourself you didn't become a casualty. You chose to walk away with yourself intact, perhaps fearing that if you didn't, maybe you couldn't sustain what you had sustained up to that moment.
You were right. Yes, absolutely right. I think I probably sensed that if I didn't walk away then, I'd go under. And because all these people who there were all these people having breakdowns and things, and people who were more or less in love with Mother Elizabeth. And I mean, it wasn't publicly announced that they were in love with her, but you can sort of tell, everyone was a bit in love with her. She was one of these magnetic people. And she had many very good qualities, which makes it harder, because she wasn't a sort of horrible hunchback baddie. She was alluring, and she used her allure and she used her personal magnetism to play people off against each other. And it's very, anyway, there were some big problems there. But I could see it. I think looking back, I did manage to have clear-sightedness and walk away with myself intact, just in the nick of time, because I was sort of feeling.
Of time.
It was difficult leaving, though. I mean, after you've left, it's very difficult reconstructing a sense of a viable life after you've left something. Because when you're in that bubble of a closed community, the bubble provides all your needs. In terms of it's not just a job, it's your home, it's your family, it's your identity, it's your purpose. And of course, you have a roof over your head and you have food and you don't have to think about money. And so afterwards, it's very difficult. Anyway, that's potentially another book.
Yeah, I mean, you say in the epilogue, though, that you can take the nun out of the monastery, but or is it the other way around, but not the monastery out of the nun, which I thought was, a wonderful way of putting it. But you brought with you, didn't come away wounded, did you, Catherine? You brought all the treasures with you.
I'm so pleased to hear you say that, because I like to think, and I hope that is the case. I like to think that is the case. I mean, for a couple of years, No, I don't think I did feel completely a victim actually, but it's taken me a while to feel, and also particularly the opportunity I've had to put it into a book and for people to sort of take it seriously the way you are. You see, Mother Elizabeth, they would say, "Oh, don't be silly." They would have, you know, the book, writing the book or any of the thoughts that go into that would be seen as kind of, oh, who wants to know about that? Just uh, you should forget about yourself. But actually, it has been an important part of
Yeah,
dealing with the experience and
yeah,
somehow not being a victim of it.
yeah.
Yeah.
No, I mean, you definitely don't come across as a victim. And you do say, in spite of the troubles, in spite of the ill wind from the underworld, you you carried away with you all these wonderful memories of the silence and the contemplative prayer, the sacred moments, the union with the beloved and so on, and all that, which had become, as you say, deeply embedded in you,
I very,
um,
very deeply embedded. And I think the solitary, I think one thing that maybe predisposed me to sort of go into it so deeply was during those years, when my father was in decline in my early 20s, I did start getting very introspective, and that was my Dostoevsky phase. And then my conversion experience phase and all this sort of deep reading. I'd had to do all that in quite a solitary way. I wasn't part of a community, and I'd cultivated an interior life, and I'd cultivated quite extended periods of prayer before I went into the Carmel because I felt quite alone in the world. I mean, my family had more or less disintegrated when my father died. Well, before my father died, our house was sold, and my mother more or less moved on and was unfortunately not really accessible. I mean, she didn't really, she wasn't very maternal, sadly, poor mum. We didn't have any support basically from the adult world, and I think I found an interior life that and I think probably even going back earlier, music as a teenager, again, I'd had a
yeah,
life, I'd been at boarding school and the music was a lifeline. So I think I'd learned probably quite early on for lifelines to be something sort of spiritual and transcendent and
yes,
interior
yes,
that wasn't necessarily it wasn't mediated by a group, it was a personal connection.
yes,
And so I did go into it deeply. And I think, um, yes, I can't remember what you just said, but anyway, when I left, I think by the time I left, I think I had interiorized, as you said.
yes,
That's right.
yes,
I'd had some hard knocks and I had a lot of questions. But I had interiorized some of the treasures, and I kept,
yes,
that the beauty of that life has never
yes,
ever faded. I go back into monastic settings very readily for retreats and things like that, and
yes,
I think I kept with me the sense of God as a personal presence, personal beloved companion in life.
yeah,
Not just companion, that's too human. It's I've just kept a sense of I no, I'm struggling here. I think I'll start again. It's I don't think the sense of God's presence hasn't left me, and the sense that God is somehow over everything, and that you can access God at any moment just by acknowledging him, by sending up a few words of a prayer, or through music, or through joy, just thanking God for the good stuff in
yes,
life. These are things you can do anywhere without the whole architecture of religion. You can find the spiritual, and I think
yes,
I've just interiorized a lot of that and interiorized some of the good
yes,
lessons from the monastic life. And there's a lot of discipline that you take away with you too, which probably enabled me to cope
yeah, yeah.
with difficult times.
What a wonderful and deep and profound journey that you shared with us, dear Catherine. I'm so pleased, and I know I speak for everybody else to have come upon it, and I mean, I've listened to it probably now, too many times. It would be embarrassing to say, but I really have. I've loved your work. I've loved your writing. I've loved your creativity. I've loved your storytelling. I've just really loved everything about it. It's been most enlightening, and I'm full of gratitude for you in writing it and sharing it with us all. Um, I'm going to
Thank
open
you.
it up now to um, uh,
Yes.
questions. And I mean, I think people might want to ask you a little bit about after the cloister as well. Yeah.
Whatever. Is everyone going to pop up? Oh yeah, no, I can see.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm trying to see see each individual, but
Perhaps when
yeah.
people ask a question, they can begin by just introducing themselves just ever so slightly, so Catherine has an idea of who you are. But please, we're handing over to the gallery now for questions.
Hi, I'm a Jenny, and I feel quite guilty about being a Jenny after reading your book. So, but I
Sorry,
loved your book.
random choice of names. Sorry.
We're not all like that. But anyway, I loved the book, and I've got so many questions, but I'll try and keep it contained. And at the beginning, regarding the loss of your dad, and I felt that really profoundly when you wrote about it, um, and I think most of us have suffered a great loss. But you said today that in a way you're still searching, and I wondered with the depth. I mean, I was so taken by your experience of the cell. There are so many things about your book I could talk about. um, did you ever find that connection to your father, or a feeling that he was out there somewhere? I got a sense today that you are still searching for that.
Oh, for my actual dad.
Your
Oh
dad, yeah.
yeah, Dad. I talk to Dad all the time. He's, I mean, no, I've always felt no. When I say searching, I don't mean that I felt I. I mean, obviously, I lost my father when he died in
Mm,
a really kind of horrible way. But I mean, the loss was horrible. But there was this sense that he was. I could talk to him, and I just sensed it. I just had a sense that he was always around, and I still feel
mm,
like that. The funny thing
oh,
is, my mother died actually 8 years ago, um, and I've never felt that with her. It's really strange. I mean, she's just buried here in Oxford because she came up to Oxford for the last year of her life, and I actually, yeah, I sort of had to. I was sort of her carer really for her last year, and she's buried here. And I went to the grave just 2 days ago, and it's like nothing. It's just like a tumbleweed. I don't know where she's just not there. And I keep saying, Mum, you know. So it's not just that I conjure this into reality, into existence.
mm,
Dad is
mm,
just there. I don't know. But
yeah.
when I say I'm searching, I don't mean I'm searching for my father anymore, because it's delightful when I see a photo of him or hear his voice in recording. It's very moving, but he's never completely gone away. What has gone, of course, is his, physical reality on Earth, which was very difficult when I was young.
Mm,
But
mm,
no, when I say searching, I mean searching, the big search,
yeah,
to make
I do.
sense of everything
Yeah.
spiritual, the big one. I mean, the
Mm,
overall search, when I was, okay, to go back to when I was in my 20s, well, I started off, I didn't know much about Christianity. I'd had I'd had a certain amount of C of E Christianity as a child, but I felt there was so much I didn't know and I needed to learn about. And I
mm.
still am fascinated by theology and philosophy, and I think about it a lot. I don't think we ever fully arrive, do we?
No,
I don't know if I've
but
answered your question.
yeah, you have very much so. And what struck me, I just want to say this is, you know, that for me today, especially meeting you, is the fact that um, I think you embody that kind of you you are that depth of um, that's within you despite your experience. It feels that was there so firmly within you, and it is within you.
Yeah.
But yeah, your book has really had an effect.
Thank you so much,
So
Jenny. I mean, it
thank you.
no, it means so much to hear, people I would never have met otherwise, like you, and people like Hazel, who's written to me, people who've written to me. It means so much to realize that it's not just me writing, in the dark, talking to myself, that it does make sense to people.
Mm,
And I suppose, in terms of archetypes, there are things we've all experienced, archetypal sort of experiences in life, as you said, of the big loss and things. So, well, I feel, I'm now, I turned 60 a couple of years ago. Had time to sort of really, I have had time, a few decades working on all this. And I feel so much, the older I get, the happier I feel. I just feel maturing is great, because it's like, it was being in my 20s that was really difficult.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Sorry about the name.
So am
I
I.
was thinking, oh, there's bound to be some really nice people called Jenny, and that I.
I've been, Mark, I would say, in introduction. I've been listening to your book all week, and I'm feeling now that it's a continuation, a live continuation of reading, making sense of some of it, extra bits being added on. And throughout listening to it, I mean, I was enthralled by it, but within that enthralling, I went to different sides of emotion, as you were telling the story. Earlier on this evening, you mentioned a healing process. And if a healing process is needed as a result of harm or damage or injury to the person, whether physically, mentally, emotionally, whatever, was there more healing within the community because of life outside it, or after the community, is that when a significant healing came around for you?
Do you mean healing from like the early stuff, like my father's death, or do you mean healing from the problems in the community and the difficulties of monastic life?
Both. Where
Yeah.
where does the most significant healing take place, or is it a continuum through living?
Oh, well, let me think for a moment. I think it's been slow. I mean, I think in the early years in Carmel, I wouldn't have just said in the first couple of years that I had experienced healing, because I think I felt very vulnerable and very raw for years after my father's death. It took a long time to not feel. And I don't know, I think possibly being young is like that. I don't know if it's like that for everyone, but there's a lot of emotional turmoil going on. I mean, does everyone have that throughout their 20s and most of their 30s? I mean, I just remember an awful lot of emotional turmoil. And and it was you were told that it was somehow childish, or that you should snap out of it, which, I don't know. I don't know what else you could say to somebody, but that didn't seem particularly helpful. I mean, it did make you feel um crushed. So I think a lot of the when I say healing, probably palpable healing, stuff that feels like healing, it's probably been more recent, really.
Right.
I
Yeah.
think,
Yeah.
yeah, I think probably I probably needed to leave the community to get a real sense of, yeah. I mean, lots of things have happened to me, but I'm married now, which seems to me totally ridiculous. I never thought I'd marry, and I never felt that I wanted to marry. But I met a very nice chap in a choir. I love music, and I thought, well, I'd give him a go. He was insistent that we were made for each other. I'll go give it. I mean, actually, he's shown me a lot of love and devotion, and actually, I realised, sounds really pathetic, but I realised I never felt loved like that before. And of course, it's difficult. We have our differences. He's not at all engaged with things like Catholicism. I try. He doesn't seem to take much interest. I mean, he's the music. You see, he's the thing is he's very musical, and he does a lot of music. And I think feeling actually loved, by somebody who's prepared to be really kind to you. It sounds pathetic, but it just makes me feel so much happier.
And healing helps, yeah. And when I heard you tell that story, I was sort of relieved and glad and happy. It was a movie one that surprised me, but was delightful. Very briefly, as I was listening today, I went through different things of the good and bad, the individual versus the group, humanity's different sides of it. And right at the end, you crystallize my experience of the whole book. And I've written down here, you don't need to be religious to be with God. And I just thank you for that.
Yeah.
Just landed.
Thank you. I'm really glad that landed. Because I don't want this to be a preachy book or a book just for religious people. You know, God is so much bigger, and God, of course, is just a word, whatever and I think the older I get, the more I realize I had something through music before I ever even got, Catholicism. So
yeah, well, thank you.
Thank you.
Catherine. Oh, hello, Cynthia Fleming here.
Hi.
Fellow musician. I was a musician in my professional life.
Oh.
I wanted to ask you a question. When you told the story of being asked to play and you chose Bach,
Yeah.
I know that experience very well, that the connection you can feel to spirit when you play that sort of music is palpable. And it's not only apparent to us, it's apparent to the people that we're playing for. Now, I wonder, this struck me, and I feel compelled to ask you this question. Did you feel at the time that you had crossed a line when you were interrupted in mid-flow? Did you feel that perhaps the people in charge there felt there was a conflict of interest? Was the experience with the Carmelites, did you feel that they wanted you to just exclusively have one access to spirituality, and that perhaps you were showing people that this isn't the only way, that there are many connections to spirit? Because that really, it disturbed me that they would cut you off like that in mid-flow. I was heartbroken for you. So that was, if that makes any sense.
Yes, I think that's a really good point, because in the book I presented it as kind of an emotional thing of, the abruptness of being cut off, and of course Mother would have said that, Mother Elizabeth would have said that any feeling I had of, hurt from that would have been, from the ego, and I should just, don't be so silly, that's just self, that's self. And actually quite a few people have mentioned that passage to me and said, oh, how brutal they felt it was, that the way she cut you off. And so I'm glad it didn't come across as petty. And I think what you said, Cynthia, is really perceptive, that maybe they did perceive that I was tapping into another channel, if you like, and that it was, not a rival way of accessing the spiritual, but perhaps something like that.
Sort of
perhaps
scary,
it was
almost a little scary.
Yes, and also perhaps it might have seemed a sort of a relatively sophisticated channel for Bach, specifically. I don't know, it might have felt like, not everyone can necessarily pick up an instrument and play, a Bach saraband or whatever it was. It takes a few years, acquiring the accomplishment to do that. So I think maybe it did feel threatening, that it wasn't just, and of course it wasn't something that was under her control. It's like, actually, what you're saying reminds me of, in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, obviously the Hebrew Bible was very much against idolatry and people going through any channels other than the approved ones. And there are one or two stories. There's a story that always used to worry me, was actually, I feel like I'm changing the subject a lot, but I think I'll put this out there. The Witch of Endor. Do you know that story? Is it Samuel? No, it's King Saul. King Saul, the first king. Is it King Saul? I think it is. He goes to consult the Witch of Endor. And let me think, is it King Saul? Does anyone know? Anyway, and this is seems a terrible offense to God, because no, wait a minute. No, I've got it wrong. That's it. No, I think it's Saul goes to the witch and asks her to bring Samuel the prophet up back from the dead. So she's like a medium, and Samuel comes up and says, "Why are you disturbing me? And let me go back into this shale." But he gets really condemned for this, consulting the witch, because a witch, it was just a form of magic or of mystery or of spiritual access that was not under the control of the priestly class. And it's not necessarily that it was inherently bad, it was just another channel. So maybe music, is a very, very potent channel.
Oh, yes.
And it's not under the control, if it's not under the control of the powers that be, they will sense that. Yeah, I think that's a really good point.
I think if you had played it in a way that wasn't so obviously connected, it wouldn't have troubled her so much.
Absolutely. If I played it in a mechanical way, but I was entering into it. And I think, as Caroline said, when she alluded to the passage, it was like this bird being set free. They could probably sense that my inner, that I was expanding and taking flight. And it was kind of like, oh, well, we can't encourage that. Can't encourage that freedom. Yeah, maybe I think you're really onto something there. Yeah.
Thank you.
Can I just come in here? Because I was a musician. I mean, I still am, but I was a professional musician before I became a therapist. And what struck me, which I feel totally, firstly, that Bach, of course, wrote everything to the glory of God and said that if anything that wasn't written for God was just noise. So I always thought Bach was very interesting from that point of view, but that music can be prayer. It is like prayer. And there is that dimension. I played the oboe, and especially playing in churches and playing something like Bach, and the whole building is acoustically, it's just built to receive it.
Yes.
It's not like playing the sports hall where the sound just goes clunk, clunk, goes across and just drops. The sound, just the whole building breathes, and there is a point where it takes over. It's not us playing. Yes. We're privileged to have that technique and that wonderful opportunity, but there's something beyond.
I totally agree with you. Absolutely agree.
Yeah.
Yes, I didn't know about how the resonance of the church can actually channel it, like the architecture all pointing up to God. It's all I suppose there is this conflict, isn't there, between the human striving and what a human can do to glorify God.
Yeah.
And it can be perceived as a rival to.
Yes, except of course it's a vessel for them, for us to experience that.
Yes. And I think, Bach, you really feel it with Bach, don't you? That it is the glory of, and certain other composers. I know. Thank you. It's nice to know that musicians are, resonating with this.
Yeah, I'd like to come in, Catherine. I came to Rock Bank through Hazel, who was interested in group dynamics, and so I'm accessing what I've heard you talk about. I haven't read your book, but I'm terribly interested in the group dynamics that were palpable in your experience, and also my experience of other people who were priests and nuns who I worked with in a mental health organization. So they were people who'd come to the organization via disaffection or difficulties in the cloistered life,
Really?
Yeah. So I worked with Catholic priests and others. So it was terribly interesting because one of my, I'm saying is group dynamics and if you like, the universality of dynamics in terms of needs and what happens and what I think the difficulty in most organizations is that autocratic, total, absolute leadership, and also total communities are so. I was also university based a lot, and there are other sort of sanctuaries that are very manipulative and hierarchical, and there was such a lot of kind of fundamental truth in your story that I really wanted to comment on. I mean, I'm also a lover of Bach, so which is another universal, but that isn't my point. My point really is how profoundly universal the predicament, and not being a self. Of course, if you have an absolute power, there's there's no room for another self. So you've got a magnetic personality, as you've described.
Yeah, that absolutely. The word autocratic totally it fits, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
And I wonder whether she realized that she was. I think she was funny. She was a person who had charisma, definitely. And although she probably wasn't unintelligent, I don't know about, where she would sit on that sort of spectrum, because she hadn't had a lot of higher education, I don't think, or a lot of, I just don't think she was necessarily self-aware about all this. I mean, I assumed that it was unconscious, all this kind of.
I think that, I mean, if you, I'm going to, just to modern politics. I mean,
Yeah.
autocrats are on the rise, and part of their appeal is an easy life. It sort of they're going to take care of us. So the appeal is that it's all taken care of, and that goes with the whole structure of a total organization. So you can just relax, and it's all very predictable. So I mean, you would have your inner life, which was being fulfilled for your needs at the time, but the whole structure would be supporting its existence, and then the leaders have to be leaders who, I wouldn't have said that there's necessary consciousness, but there would be a manipulation, a consciousness of manipulation, because you're dealing. I mean, I will now be a psychologist, which I am. Is that you're dealing with a narcissist? So narcissists don't, by and large, have deep. Well, they're very busily holding on to their own needs and self, and but they're extremely good at reading situations and the needs of others. And that's how they maintain control, if they're also autocrats, and they often are.
Yeah, I know, that really makes sense.
Yeah.
And I think she was actually aware of pulling the strings. There are a few things I can remember. I didn't put in the book. I remember one thing that really stood out was on one of the few occasions when I was sort of actually privy to, I was with her and a couple of others who were sort of seen as her close, coterie sort of thing. She mentioned laughingly about something she was going to require of the community or put out there, and I remember saying, and she said, "Oh," well, and it was almost contemptuous of the individuals. It was like, "Oh, we'll get them." And I said, "But would that really help them to grow spiritually?" I said something, across the line. So I said something. The subtext, at least, of it would have been, would that really be a true or right thing, or will that help them spiritually? I probably didn't put it like that. And she said, "It doesn't matter. It'll work. It works." And I remember the words, "It works." That opened my eyes to the fact that she was a pragmatist and she wanted things to work in a way that would maintain the status quo. And it was things like that were real red flags to me and made me feel incensed in a quiet sort of way, because I thought, she doesn't care about the spiritual growth of the individual. She just cares about the conformity and the line towing. And that's where, I probably felt quite a lot of anger about certain things, but we are so trained to not show anger. And I probably also, the way I grew up was, I don't find it very easy to express anger in a straightforward way. I try to sort of, it mutates into kind of, other thing. I try to sort of cover it up, whatever. But actually I did feel indignant about things like that. And it was, that was the pattern. And yeah, autocracy all the way, sadly.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. By the way, Karen, are you in this country?
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So you've got all these traumatized Carmelites coming to you. Where are you based?
I live in Bath.
Oh, you're in Bath.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Is there any monasteries around there?
No, this was London oh no, that was a London organization. It was a UK-based mental health organization, so lots and lots of services. So it had very long arms. It was also international. So it's changed its form. But when I was there in the 80s, and the late 80s and into the 90s, it was a very interesting place. And I just learned a great deal. It was also run by a kind of megalomaniacal autocrat. So, but what I want to get across is just that institutionalized,
Yeah.
and the institutionalization, and that various people really kind of trying to do it differently. It just takes it takes a lot more time. But
well, they like the settled, they like the comfort of being unassailed in their position. Yeah, it's the same. This is the other thing. I was incensed and indignant with this side of things in the community, but now with a few decades, growing up behind me, I realize it is archetypal, isn't it? And you get it. I've heard you get it in the universities and you get it in the big institutions. So I'm a bit less harsh now on the Catholic institutions because I realize it is probably put any group of people together, especially if you lock them up. Throw away the key, basically. I mean, I had to, I talk about the key at the beginning. I had to find the key to get out in the middle of the night. It was a crazy thing to do in a way. It took a lot of guts, I suppose, because it wasn't like the doors were open. We were bolted in. So, lock a load of people up together and leave them on some deserted plain and give them a load of medieval rules. I mean, obviously there are going to be problems. So.
Well, but there are other ways you lock people up, and that's the other thing that I learned in terms of the characters who were out. They were no longer in their orders. They'd found their way out, but they were still absolutely caught up in it.
Yeah.
Psychologically. So it's very hard to become free. So I mean, I want to just say congratulations. I also appreciate your incredible candor and thoughtfulness throughout this session. So I'm very grateful to hear from you.
Thank you. I think actually just going back to something someone else said earlier about how long it took to get that sort of freedom. I think for the first, if you'd met me, 20 years ago, I mean, I've been out for 23, 24 years, nearly 25 years, 24 years, I think. If you'd met me 20 years ago, I would have been very caught up in it still. The way you said people, I would have been very caught up in it. I mean, nearly every night I dreamt I was back in the monastery for years, and it gradually started fading out. It takes a long, long time. And I've been very lucky that I was able to find a new life in Oxford. I was incredibly lucky that a few doors opened and I was able to study here and do a theology degree for 3 years, which meant I could question everything and talk to people who wanted to discuss and get to the truth a bit more through, reading and intellect and discussion. And that was really healthy for me. And then all the music, and it does take a long time though. Yeah.
Thank you, Catherine. It's been a wonderful discussion afterwards, hasn't it? I don't know whether anybody else has any final questions. We're actually at 6 o'clock now. So it just remains then for us all to say.
It's Hazel waving.
Yeah, that's me. I just wanted to say, Catherine, how much I hand it to you for hanging together and not falling apart. I was in a slightly similar condition and I fell apart and you didn't, and I really hand it to you for that.
Well, Hazel, thank you. You were a lot younger though, weren't you? Weren't you a teenager when you went in? And it was, yeah. Well, thank you. I mean, I don't know why I didn't fall apart, but things were also, when you went in, was it the 60s?
1961.
I mean, it was really, really harsh in those days, wasn't it? And have you read Karen Armstrong? And, yeah. So, well, thank you, Hazel. Thank you for all your, lovely messages and support.
And thank you, Catherine.
No, not at all. It's really means so much to know that I've been able to connect with others who know a bit about, who've experienced it. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Catherine. It's been an absolute delight. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I hope we'll see more of you.
Well, thank you very much for having me. And it is such a privilege to be listened to. This is the other thing, like people want to listen to me now. People, actually want, and this is quite new for me. One's used to being shut up, and it's great, and as a woman as well, you're really realizing that I have got something that people want to hear about, and to talk and discuss and share and delve into things to get closer to the truth. Thank you. It really means a lot, and I've really actually enjoyed the last couple of hours. And thank you for all
Thank you
these. I
so-
can see these little love
Thank
hearts
you.
and balloons going up.
Yes, these little love notes.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thank
Well,
you.
yeah. Well, anyway, it's been.